With that though, we will get started on our main presentation and discuss the challenges of implementing sustainable cropping systems in northeastern Australia. Don't want to take any thunder away from our presenter tonight, Professor Mike Bell from the School of Agriculture and Food Sciences up at the Gatton campus, who I'm sure will provide us with plenty of information and some fascinating stories in this interesting space. Professor Bell.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. Pleasure to be here. I often have trouble with people addressing me as professor, and we do a lot of work in Southeast Asian countries and particularly in Vietnam, and it took me 3 years to get them, and instead of calling me professor, I got them to Professor Mike, and that was about as close as I could get. So please, if anyone calls me professor, I'll leave. It's Mike. The topic we're talking about tonight is the challenges for sustainable cropping systems in Northeast Australia. Northeast Australia, I was asked, where am I talking about? Essentially from central New South Wales through to as far north as cropping goes and across into the Territory and the Ord. So that's at the area that we do most of our work, although we are involved in agriculture around the rest of the country. So, so cropping systems around the world are under pressure. We've got a world population that's forecast to increase by 50% in the next 30 years. And we've got a world food demand that's expected to increase by 70 to 80% over that same period. There'll also be changing dietary preferences as people look to increase the amount of protein in diets. And so a big challenge for food production systems. And if you look at the graph at the bottom there, you can see that in the cropping, Australia is expected to play its fair share in that increased food production. Now, projections are wonderful things because the people who make the projections don't have to actually deliver the outcomes. So I guess that's what I wanted to talk a bit about today, was how realistic are those projections about increased food productivity, and what are the headwinds that are going in the direction to stop us being able to achieve that? So essentially, can cropping systems arise to the challenge? And I guess if you look at the history, grain cropping systems in Australia, this is wheat yields in Australia have declined over a period up to about the early 1900s, and then have increased in a series of steps over the years as different varieties are introduced, different technologies are introduced, herbicides, superphosphate fertilizers. Each one has delivered a productivity increase. But you'll notice that there's the millennium drought up here slowed things down a little bit, as it does. And what you'll see shortly, and is pretty evident from the figure below, is our productivity gains have been slowing compared to the rest of the world. If you look in Queensland, this is the central graph here. You can look at, that's decadal yields for wheat in the blue and sorghum in the red. You can see there's been some spectacular increases over that same period of time. But again, that data is goes up to about 2000, and since 2000, things have slowed down a fair bit in terms of the increased productivity. And if you look at, again, using wheat yields, the average for the rest of the world over time, that's over a 50-year period, nearly 60-year period, wheat yields across the world are increasing pretty steadily. You can see in Australia, which is the black line, our yields increased for a while, but for the last 20 odd years, our wheat yields have tended to plateau. So in terms of productivity increases, in terms of wheat production, our yields are not increasing at the same rate as the rest of the world. So if you look at land use across Australia, Australia's certainly got lots of large area that's allocated to agriculture. The red graph there is millions of hectares of managed pasture. The blue is cropped area. And as you can see, the cropped area tended to increase up to about 2000 and then tended to plateau, and that increase was associated with a decline in the pasture area. So as there's a lot of movement from mixed cropping systems or grazing systems, particularly in southern Australia, into cropping. But from about 2000 onwards, that shift has actually declined. So essentially, that's telling us that the area of land available for cropping, or the good land available for cropping, is largely cropping now, and our opportunities to increase cropped area are low. So really, we're looking at that's the cropped area in that bottom graph there. It's plateaued. You can see our productivity has tended to increase. So we're looking at intensification of existing cropland rather than increasing the area of land cropped if we're going to meet these higher productivity targets. And there's a number of challenges. And I want to go sort of look at these from a higher level perspective first, because I think they set the scene for some of the issues that I want to talk about in a bit more detail. First one's economic. I guess everything comes back to economics and money availability. But as cropping areas have intensified, that's been accompanied by a rapid rise in production costs. Costs for the overheads, costs for the land, for financing, for farm inputs. And so as you can see, as we've started to see these rapid increases in production, we've also seen rapid increases in overheads. So the profit margins are getting squeezed because the costs going up. I know I often look back at some of my grandmother's receipts from corn sold back in the mid-20s, 1920s that is, and you convert pounds to dollars, and there's not a lot of difference in grain prices. That's happened in 100 years, but the input costs have certainly changed in a considerable margin. Add to that, we've had some pretty tough seasonal conditions and added to the yield stagnation. So if you look at the impacts of the post-climatic or the post-2000 climate on profitability for all industries, that big bar is this is across Australia. It's dropped by about 25 to 30%. If you look by state, this is for all across the different states of Australia, everyone's negative. So everyone's been going backwards. So it's a pretty tough economic environment for cropping systems to be working in, as well as agriculture in general. Now, in addition to economics, we've got some biophysical challenges. Climate variability. I won't call it climate change. I'll call it climate variability for the moment. I guess history will tell us whether it's climate change. We've got soils that are declining in their resilience. Our organic matter's declining. We've got increased pathogen pest pressure. We've got less natural resilience in those systems to bounce back after in tough seasonal conditions. Our soil fertility is going backwards because we listened to economists who told us that you only fertilise when you get a return on investment. And of course, like all good credit limits, you can keep extracting out of that bank balance until you run out of credit. And a lot of our soils are starting to run out of credit now, and we're having to put more and more fertilisers back into them to keep them productive. We've got increasing incidence of pesticide and herbicide resistance. So the weeds are harder to kill. Our pests are getting harder. We have to be more careful about how we manage our pests in our cropping systems. We've got invasive species, like you may have heard of fall armyworm coming into the country a few years ago. It started out eating corn. It now eats corn and sorghum and millet and just about anything else it gets its teeth into. And there's very limited pesticides that can actually control it. So we're in this business of continually trying to chase our tails and develop strategies to manage an increasing range of pathogens. We've also lost a lot of the diversity in our crop rotations. As we've gone to intensified cropping, we've gone for the reliable crops. So we tend to grow wheat, and then something else occasionally. And we tend to grow sorghum in summer, and then we grow something else occasionally. And the reality is that those other species that are available just haven't had the breeding effort go into them, and they're not as reliable. They're not as consistent performers, and so they don't feature as often as in our cropping systems. So we've got a lot of increased complexity going on in our cropping systems. It's making decision making a bit more challenging. The other area is the social pressure on agriculture. There's a huge expectation or a huge pressure on farmers to justify the right to farm, which as someone who worked in agriculture a long time, I find it pretty challenging to deal with. And you might see me twitch occasionally as I talk my way through here on some of the issues. But things like vegetation management, achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, reef water quality, all these things are being sheeted home for agriculture to fix. And agriculture is certainly part of the problem, but it's also has to be considered part of the solution. And demonising agriculture doesn't help anyone in terms of getting change. We've got shrinking rural communities. I mean, the financial returns in agriculture that I spoke about previously have contributed to that, but so have loss of regional hospitals, regional schools, and it's harder to get families, young families, to relocate to the bush to work on in rural industries. Farms, corporate farms are getting bigger. They farm more hectares. There's bigger equipment, bigger farms, less people. And so that's a challenging environment as well. The third point is one that I had to mention in here, and I'm going to use a couple of examples here, and then I'll get off my high horse and I'll leave it alone. But to me, there's this increasing disconnect between the rural and urban communities that's, I think, a real worry. That's led to a number of issues that I guess are really challenging for agriculture. The concept of the right to cheap food. Now, if you're the recipient of cheap food, that's great. If you're producing that food and your production costs are going through the roof, having low prices for your agricultural product is a real challenge to your business operation. So that whole issue of society has a right to cheap food, but farmers have a right to make a living at the same time producing that food. So somewhere there's a disconnect that's really developed in there. The other two areas are unrealistic ideas about organic agriculture, which I'll touch on in some detail. And the other one is this feasibility of shifting to plant-based protein. In other words, getting rid of animal protein and moving to plant-based ones. And I think agriculture has done itself a real disservice by not challenging some of these ideas a lot more strongly. Organic agriculture, I think there's some facts that people probably aren't aware of, is if you compare organic agriculture in the truest sense of the word with conventional agricultural systems, you're looking at agriculture that will produce about 35% less food per hectare than conventional agriculture. So immediately we're trying to increase productivity by 50%, and we're going to tie one hand behind our back and start 35% behind the 8 ball if we move that way. Not using conventional fertilisers and substituting manures and organic waste would require us to probably treble or quadruple our animal herds to produce the waste to be able to do it, much less distribute that waste and incorporate it into agricultural systems. And the reality is it's waste. It's not a balanced fertiliser, it's a waste. And so even if you were able to use it, it wouldn't give you the balanced nutrition that a crop requires to grow. The other thing about manures and waste is that all you're doing is simply transferring nutrients that were extracted from one area and moving them into another. You're doing nothing about replenishing nutrients that are harvested in the grain and exported off to the cities or overseas in ships. So it's not addressing soil fertility decline at all. Avoiding synthetic chemicals like herbicides places emphasis on more destructive and labour-intensive practices. And I'll go back to the example we've had in from work we were doing in Laos, up in the really steep mountainous country where they're growing corn. The government suddenly came out with a legislation that said we're going to ban herbicides. They're dangerous. And so immediately, the only thing that keeps soil on those steep slopes is having cover on the ground using no-till agriculture. And by banning herbicides, immediately they went back to animal cultivation, conventional cultivation, and the soil is disappearing off those slopes at a remarkable rate. Again, a decision made without real enough information to make a sensible judgment. So there's a whole lot of literature out there which basically says the higher yields provided by conventional agriculture offer a more sustainable strategy than a chemical-free agricultural system at the global level for meeting the needs of a growing population. And if those of you who are interested can look up that reference I showed at the bottom there, it provides a very interesting discussion on the topic, but it's only one of many. The other bit is the feasibility of shifting from animal to plant-based protein. Now, I mean, I eat tofu and tempeh and all those pulse or legume food products just as well as anyone else. But the reality is that we cannot phase out animal protein and substitute plant protein for a number of reasons. There's just not the land available to increase the crop production to start with. There's a lack of investment, as I said before, in developing these crops to a level where they can be tolerant of stress and produce reliably under tough seasonal conditions. And any increase in plant-based protein is effectively going to have to occur at the expense of cereal grains, which are the food staples on which a lot of the population already exists. I think the important point that people forget is that animal protein can be produced sustainably and at scale from land not suited to broadacre cropping. So those food production systems are complementary, and if we try and substitute one for the other, we end up going backwards in terms of the food production issue of food production in total. So I think it's an unrealistic expectation, and again, it's a one that agriculture hasn't spoken out loudly enough to raise people's awareness of some of these facts. So I've got off my high horse now, and so we can go back and talk about broadacre cropping industries. I'm going to focus on the grains industry primarily because the grains industry is the dominant cropping industry in Australia. It occupies about 21 million hectares cropped annually, produces about 40 million tonnes worth of grain. That it's worth about $13 billion at the farm gate. If you contrast that with the other two broadacre cropping industries that we also work with, cotton and sugarcane, both of them occupy about 400,000 hectares a year. So they're and very small geographic areas, which I've illustrated the river valleys in New South Wales and Queensland with cotton, and the pockets of sugarcane production along coastal Queensland. But I'm going to focus on the grains industry because the sheer scale of it means that it's the biggest industry and you multiply some of the issues that are going on by the number of hectares and you can get some pretty big problems pretty quickly. I neglected to mention in there that the grains industry in southern Australia is predominantly grown on in-season rainfall in winter. So fallows over summer tend to be hot and dry, not a lot happens. It rains, or there's an expectation of rain, crops are in, they grow when the evaporative demand is low, they're harvested before it gets, at the tail end of spring and into early summer. In the north, rainfall tends to be a lot more unreliable, or a lot more variable. So in the north, we tend to crop on stored soil water. So we'll leave a field fallow until we've accumulated enough water in that soil profile to know we're going to get a crop, and then we'll make a planting decision. We're going to rely on, no, rely is the wrong word. We're going to take a punt on the weather forecast, the seasonal forecast, which tell us it's going to be wetter than average or drier than average, to try and change our yield expectations, because where we know we've got a certain amount of water in the soil, we're going to add an expectation of getting a certain extra amount in season. We don't necessarily know when that's going to come or how it's going to come in one big dollop or evenly distributed across the season. So in some ways, the guys in southern Australia say at least you know you've got a crop because you've got water in the soil. That's true, but we don't really know how big a crop, and so it's really difficult to plan for how that crop's going to go. And that does cause a few problems. This just illustrates that. Essentially, here you're looking at a plot of evapotranspiration through a crop for a winter crop. So low over summer, you've got a crop in the ground, you start to use water, and then that crop matures and your water use declines. Conversely, here you're looking at rainfall. Rainfall's high, much higher than evapotranspiration. So you're accumulating water in the soil, you're storing it, and then you're using it to grow a crop. And then before you sow the next crop, you're waiting for that water to start to accumulate again. And that's the secret to success. The difficulty in terms of, say, fertility management is that if you can't rely on rainfall during the growing season, you're going to have to make all your nutrient decisions, all your fertiliser decisions before you plant a crop, often earlier in the fallow. You're guessing at what a yield target might be, and that creates some uncertainty in terms of, well, how much do I put on? What is my target? And that creates a few challenges. I'll just touch on the water accumulation and finish off on that. So the management systems that are developed in northern cropping systems focus on maximising the amount of water that infiltrates. So you're trying to minimise runoff and you're trying to minimise evaporation. So you're trying to maximise that storage. You keep cover on the soil surface, you don't till during the fallows, and you try and maximise the amount of water you accumulate. Even doing all those sorts of things, our fallow efficiencies are typically only 25% or less. So 25% of the water that falls actually gets stored for later use. And if you think about it, every time you have a small rainfall event, a lot of that actually evaporates again rather than increasing deeper into the profile. So it's not surprising that those numbers are low. We've also developed agronomic systems that ensure water is conserved during the growing season. So, for example, that bottom graph there, or bottom picture there, is a skip row sorghum. So every third row of sorghum isn't planted. And what that ensures is that there's water stored in that bare space for later on in the growing season, so that as the crop roots slowly expand outwards, there's water still there for the crop to use during grain filling. So it maximises the chances of getting a yield at the end of the growing season rather than running out of water and having a crop essentially collapse before the business end of the growing season. So a lot of these things have been evolved over a number of years with a strong focus on water management. But there's a lot of implications of that, and that's where the challenges for our cropping system come from. Fields are fallow for however long it takes to recharge that profile. Fertiliser rates are conservative due to the uncertainty of what your yield target's going to be and your nutrient demand. Application strategies are limited by your desire to keep tillage to a minimum. So things tend to be applied shallow and just tickled into the soil. And a reliance on upfront fertiliser inputs increases the risk of gaseous nitrogen losses, and in particular nitrous oxide, which contribute to a greenhouse gas profile. So I want to touch on each one of those and talk about some of the limitations that we're dealing with and how we're trying to track on, how we're making progress. So broadacre cropping, if you compare it to other land uses, has seen a large decline in soil organic matter and carbon. And that's simply a carbon balance thing. We're burning off more carbon than we're actually putting back into the system. If you think about it, our systems are fallow for a long period of time and we're not growing anything. We're making sure there's no weeds or anything else growing in that crop because we're trying to store water. Microbes are sitting in soil and they're hungry as anything and saying, well, we've got a bit of organic matter here, we'll live on that in the meantime. And so organic matter levels are dropping because we're putting less carbon in. So if you look at the sorts of graphs here, this is a soil carbon content in the 0 to 10 centimetre layer of land under remnant vegetation or under cropping. And just about everywhere, there's a significant decline in the cropped land. And so on average, across this experimental series, we lost about 24 tonnes of carbon per hectare in that 10 centimetre layer. If you looked at the top 30 centimetres, it was more like 50 tonnes of carbon per hectare over that period. So everyone talks about soil carbon sequestration, and we look at a lot of what's happened in the cropland, and our carbon sequestration is negative and significantly negative. Management strategies within cropping can tweak things at the margins, but cropland is cropland is cropland because essentially it's the amount that you grow each year that determines how much carbon goes into that system. And remember, we're harvesting grain out of these systems, and that grain is probably 60% of the above ground biomass that we grow is going into the harvester bin and off to the cities or onto ships going overseas. So again, pastures and native veg, everything's recycled and going back in. So it's no wonder that cropland has lower carbon than other land uses. We can increase carbon if we change land use. And this is an example of systems that have gone back. You can see here as the top one is an example. You're comparing land that's been cropped for 45 years with land that had been cropped for 35 years and then had been sown back to pastures for 10 years. And you can see in some cases, well, you can see generally increased soil carbon accumulation where you've gone back to pastures. If you look at the rate of accumulation, it ranges from nothing through to about a tonne of carbon per hectare per year. So it's pretty slow. And those ones that are nothing are probably land where you've got declining soil fertility, and organic matter isn't just carbon, it's carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients which are processed by microbes into slowly degradable organic materials. And if you haven't got the nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur that you can lock up to form those materials, all that happens is the microbes digest the carbon, all the carbon goes back to the atmosphere as CO2, and you don't gain anything. So it's pretty tough to actually accumulate carbon again once you've run it down. There are consequences of declining soil organic matter, declining nutrients, declining soil structure and lower rainfall infiltration, a decline in important biological functions like disease suppression. So essentially the soils become less resilient over time. The nutrient decline is interesting because when you actually, it's a soil that's lost 2% in soil carbon and the associated organic matter. If you look at the nutrient decline that's associated with that, just in the top 10 centimetre layer, you're looking at $3,000 to $4,000 a hectare of capital that's been used to sustain your previous cropping enterprise. In many cases, that's worth more than the land itself. It's funny that land values don't actually reflect the organic matter content, which is good for some, not so good for others, I guess. Depends on whether you're selling or buying. So the challenge for cropping industries, I think, is that there's a lot of noise out there about soil carbon and soil carbon credits and soil carbon sequestration and all the potential money that you can make by signing up to accreditation schemes. And I guess the message is we've got to be really, really careful in signing up for these sorts of things because you're accountable. You may have signed up, the brokers talked you into it, but you're the guy when they come in and say that carbon that you say you accumulated over the last 10 years isn't here, you're the one who's got to pay all the money back. So it's a pretty risky environment, and it's one that I think people get tricked into getting involved in without understanding the consequences. I think from the cropping industry perspective, we need to manage the residues that are generated to maximum effect, keep the ground cover, manage the disease suppression. A good example, this picture here, it might be a bit hard to see from back there, but you look at the colour of the root systems here in the top 5 centimetres under a sugarcane trash blanket, and then you look at the colour of the root system and the fine roots that aren't there when you get below that trash effect. So you're going to you develop a real suppressive biology under the trash blanket that keeps the diseases away. Root systems are healthy and functional. As soon as you get deeper into profile and there's no organic matter, the pathogens have a free shot and the root systems are very or barely functional. So we've got to manage the organic matter that we've got rather than trying to going through a variety of futile strategies to increase what is difficult to increase in the first place. The other thing is when we attempted to sell, or growers attempted to sell residues off the farm, in this case, cane trash being baled up for garden mulch, I'll bet the price that they're being paid for the garden mulch is a hell of a lot less than the value of what they're selling in terms of sustainability in their cropping system. So organic matter, moving on to soil fertility and an increasing reliance on fertilisers. I think it's important for people to realise that cropping is an extractive industry. We are extracting nutrients from our soil and we're sending it off as harvested produce and as food for people off site. 60 to 80% of the plant nutrient uptake leaves the field at harvest. And if you look at the different crop species that you can grow, the concentration of nutrients in those grains also changes quite dramatically depending on what species you're growing. Native fertility reserves can partly buffer this, but there's a limit, as I said before, and eventually, the longer you crop, the more reliant you're going to be on external nutrient inputs, i.e. fertilisers. Fertilisers are expensive, so returns on investment are crucial. So the demand is linked to the crop size. So when you have difficulty predicting what that crop size is going to be, because you're making a decision before you know what the season's going to do, that makes it challenging. Applying high rates or over-applying fertilisers is risky because you can either lose that fertiliser to the environment through gaseous losses in the case of nitrogen, or that nutrient can be tied up in soil and immobilised and made not plant available. So there's a fine balancing act in there. We're trying to get the right rate in the right place at the right time without overdoing it. And that's caused a few problems. I think there's a general recognition now that we need a new approach for sustainable fertiliser management. And there's a fair bit of uncertainty about what the best practices are or the best practices are going to be. But we know that fertiliser recovery in the year of application is often low. We also know there's a residual value of that fertiliser that you can pick up in subsequent years. The trouble is we're not too sure on the proportions that we pick up from year to year, and that's going to vary with seasonal conditions. So there's a very active area of research that we're involved in at the moment, looking at isotopes to try and quantify or track fertiliser through multiple years once it's in the soil. And we're really hopeful that we can get much firmer guidelines to give industry a better understanding of what best practice is in that space. And I think ultimately we're heading towards a strategy of feeding the soil rather than trying to feed the crop. Because essentially in our environment, when the water arrives, we've got to be ready to pull the trigger and plant. And we don't have time to say, okay, now I'm starting to worry about my fertiliser program. We've got to have nutrients in place ready for the water to arrive. How we do that, I guess, is still a subject of a lot of research, but it's a big difference from the way people have tended to fertilise more recently, trying to finesse things for this coming season. It's very difficult to do. Now that we are reliant on fertilisers, we need to know where to put them, when to put it out there, how much to put out there, obviously, and what product to use. And the old diagram of the 4 R's of good nutrition, right rate, right place, right product, and right timing, have never been truer. Most people tend to think about rate because that directly relates to dollars coming out of your pocket. But often you can make more money out of putting something on at the right time and in the right place than you can out of optimising your rate. So I think people have tended to forget that a little bit. And now that we're really reliant on these fertilisers to perform, we've realised how important those other factors can actually be. To be able to do this well, we need to understand whether these nutrients are mobile in soil or whether they're not mobile. So by mobile, I mean we'll move with water through the soil profile. So if you think about our cropping system that lives on stored soil water, if the water's in the topsoil, we use it. Often the topsoils are dry and we're living in the subsoils and taking water and nutrients out of those subsoils. So mobile nutrients should be able to redistribute down through the profile as that profile wets up again. Immobile nutrients won't. And so understanding basic nutrient behaviour is really critical to understand what the best placement strategy is going to be. So something that's mobile, you can put onto the soil surface or pretty shallow, it will redistribute. Things that aren't mobile, you're going to have to actually physically place them into the soil profile, into the zones which they've been taken out of to get crop performance. Preferably not by doing this sort of operation where you get the old ploughs out, but more often by banding fertilisers and with minimal topsoil disturbance. It's interesting, we've done a lot of work with deep phosphorus placement, and some of the guys we work with have probably got a little bit carried away, as the bottom example shows. If someone's got a ripper, I can build a bigger one and I can pull it with a bigger tractor and I can get deeper. And so we're sort of doing a little bit of battling at the moment to try and convince people that deeper isn't necessarily better. And there's a sweet spot in there somewhere that you don't need a D9 or something equivalent to pull. So it's important to remember that nutrient strategies, you need to co-locate water and nutrients. And roots deplete nutrients from the soil around them, and nutrients either have to move back to the roots in water, so the soluble nutrients or the mobile ones can be supplied as water moves to the root, or alternatively for the immobile nutrients, the roots have to move to where the nutrients are to be able to exploit them. And so you've got to have, plants can be very good at exploiting concentrated patches of nutrients, but they've got to have water to get to them. So that's a critical success factor. So timing and placement are vital. If you've got mobile nutrients, you can move them down through the profile, but I don't know whether you can see that from back here, but this is the movement of nitrogen. The blue represents the distribution of nitrogen down a soil profile over time. That's a 5-year time interval there from an application that was made back in 2016. And by the time we got to 2021, it had got down to about 1 metre. That's 5 years. In that case, nearly 3,000 millimetres of rain doesn't move quickly. So it takes a long time. It's not going to happen in a growing season. So if you've got low nutrients in your subsoil, you can't move nitrogen down there quickly enough to be able to use them that growing season. Immobile nutrients need to be placed in the layers that you've extracted them from. This is a classic example here where an unfertilised block, you can look at the change in phosphorus content in the top 10 centimetres, 10 to 30, 30 to 60, all negative. Here's where a lot of phosphorus, or 20 kilos of phosphorus has been applied every year. And you can see that phosphorus has stayed in the topsoil, that's positive. But the decline in the subsoil is exactly the same as it is in the unfertilised plots. So you haven't put it in the right spot, so your subsoils are getting worse, worse, and worse. So placement is critical. Oh, I've lost the control of my mouse. That's interesting. I'll go that way. Not all species proliferate roots around a patch. We've started to work on root systems recently. I remember in my undergrad days, people said, my nutrition lecturers were telling me I'd be working in roots my whole career. I've dodged it for 40 years, but we've been dragged in kicking and screaming towards the end of it. And it's really interesting when you actually start looking at how roots react to a patch of nutrients. Up here, you can see where we've put a band of phosphorus and how, in this case, a wheat plant has multiplied roots around that patch to exploit it and done it very efficiently. You can see here we had a small patch up in the shallow soil and another patch deeper down, done a very good job. And a lot of species react like that. Unfortunately, some don't. This is 4 different varieties of mung bean, and that red circle shows where we put the same band of phosphorus fertiliser. Nothing, no response whatsoever. And funnily enough, when you do those sorts of applications in the field, that crop doesn't respond particularly well to deep placement because its root system doesn't react to it and it doesn't exploit it. So here's a very sound principle that's being undone by variation between crop species that are grown in the same cropping system. So it's challenging to get these things right. How well can deep bands address declining subsoil fertility? Well, that chickpea crop, you can see the response. You can tell where the deep bands were compared to where they weren't. And that was in the 4th crop after the deep bands were applied. So pretty effective response and really strong crop performance. But when you actually look at the bottom graph there is showing you the relationship between crop uptake and grain yield, and all the different colours represent different growing seasons. You can see that essentially the more phosphorus you can get out of those deep bands, the higher the yields are. So there's no evidence of that plateauing out, saying we've saturated the phosphorus supply. Basically, you can't get enough roots into a fertiliser band the size of my little pinky here to be able to meet the entire demand of a large crop. So we can get really good, efficient, effective responses, but we're still phosphorus deficient. We have to do more than just these bands. And so, again, the fertiliser strategy is effective, but can it keep us at high levels of productivity? And I guess I've got real question marks about that. The final topic is nitrous oxide emissions. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is essentially, we're talking about one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and one of the greenhouse gases that contributes the largest to overall greenhouse gas emissions of farms, of crop farms. Agricultural greenhouse gas emissions represent about 14% of the national emissions. So it's a lot bigger than us, but as other areas start to decrease their emissions, agriculture will become a bigger target. Agricultural emissions are dominated by methane from livestock. You can see the orange part of this is the methane from livestock. The other major component is nitrous oxide from particularly fertilisers, but also from dung and urine as it interacts in the soil. And they're the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions. For nitrous oxide, I had to throw an equation in there for you just to have a quick throwback. Nitrous oxide can be emitted in two parts of this pathway. So you're going from the process of nitrification, going from ammonium through to nitrate. Microbes will, under aerobic conditions, will emit some nitrous oxide through that part of the pathway, small amount, but it happens every time there's nitrification going on. So it's a slow dribble. And when you get anaerobic conditions, so low oxygen or waterlogged soils, and you've got a fair bit of nitrate, the microbes in soil saying, well, where's my oxygen coming from now? I've got no oxygen left. They see the oxygen sitting on a nitrate molecule and say, thank you very much, I'll take that. And so they reduce that nitrate, and you end up emitting N2O, which is the greenhouse gas. In some cases, you can emit mostly N2, which is 80% of our atmosphere, so it's very difficult to measure. But you can lose a lot of nitrogen very quickly through that denitrification process. The sources of agricultural N2O, you can see I've highlighted fertilisers and, more importantly, decomposition of crop residues. And that's an area that is emerging as a critical factor. At the moment, the Australian inventory takes some numbers that have been plucked out of Europe and said, oh, that'll apply to Australia, we'll use them. The reality is it's warmer and often wetter in our environments, and we might find some nasty surprises when we actually look at nitrous oxide emissions coming out of residues, because particularly legume residues with a high nitrogen content and an uncontrolled rate of release, we could actually end up with some quite high nitrous oxide emissions coming out of residue decomposition. The drivers, as I said, in nitrification, you want warm soils with a fair bit of oxygen, and you get relatively minor losses over an extended period. In denitrification, the example on the top right-hand side there, where you've had a big rainfall event, the soil's waterlogged, oxygen availability is down, and you've just fertilised the weeks before that. Yeah, I've got my fertiliser on and the rain's come. Wasn't I clever? In some cases, you might have been not very clever, because you could have experienced quite a significant loss of nitrogen at that time. Most of the work we've been doing has suggested that we're losing somewhere between 20 and 30% of our nitrogen applied through, certainly in the clay soils in northeastern Australia, through denitrification. So that's certainly an area that we can improve our efficiency with. Those losses tend to be highest in industries that use a lot of fertiliser and also are in warm, wet environments. So think cotton and sugarcane. Dryland grains is certainly lower rainfall environment and lower nitrogen rates, but far, far bigger areas. So when you actually start adding up the cumulative effect, the dryland grains punch above their weight in many cases. So the grains industry's got a real conundrum here too. We know that, or there's a pressure on the grains industry to minimise the use of nitrogen fertiliser because it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions coming out of agriculture. So there's a number of statistics there in terms of the percentage loss and how that increases with fertiliser nitrogen rate and how it increases in wetter environments. So there's, the simplistic solution is the bottom dot point. Oh, you can just use legumes to fix nitrogen and you don't use fertilisers. Now, we know that legumes remove most of the nitrogen that in them in harvested grain, and they don't leave a lot behind, so that immediately shoots a hole in that theory. The other side of this argument is that we know that in our grain systems, we're increasingly nitrogen limited. We've got to increase our fertiliser nitrogen input because our soil organic matter's decline. We don't have the background fertility we had before. And if we're going to grow bigger crops, we need more nitrogen. We know, as I said, grain legumes don't leave a lot. And emissions from legumes are probably going to be bigger than we actually thought they were. There are a whole new generation of fertiliser products on the market which are attempting to solve some of these loss factors. To date, we haven't seen a lot of evidence that they actually improve crop nitrogen uptake. They might reduce nitrous oxide emissions, but we're not getting any improved efficiency. They also tend to be considerably more expensive per kilogram of nitrogen than the existing standard products. So there's a lot of work to be done before the industry can switch over to different fertiliser products. So sustainable and greenhouse gas efficient farming systems of the future. There's lots of hypothetical frameworks out there being developed for future agricultural systems. I think, unfortunately, most are based on very little data. And it's great to be hypothetical, but there needs to be a reality check somewhere there. The other problem is that you've got decreasing investment in agricultural R&D to test a lot of these options in real field environments. And so that's one of the problems the industry's got, is they're being pushed and pulled in different directions, but without a lot of hard data to go on, it's very difficult to make objective decisions. Final slide. I think from the future perspective of sustainable cropping systems, we know we have to grow food production to feed a growing global population. There's no doubt about it. In the soils and cropping systems in northeastern Australia, that increase is unlikely to occur because of the many challenges facing sustainable land use, economic, social and biophysical. We're going to be struggling to hold our own in terms of food production, much less ramp it up substantially. I think part of the solution is a need to better communicate the realities of food production systems facing the under pressure agricultural community into the broader community. So there needs to be some informed discussion as to what actually goes on as opposed to what people would like to think was going on. And there's also a need to increase investment in supporting, I had to say that we need more money for research, but there is a need to increase investment in supporting research and development that underpins sustainable cropping systems, because there's fewer and fewer agricultural scientists coming out. A lot of them are older like me and are getting towards the end of their career. And there aren't the young ones coming through to do that important work. And on that depressing note, I'll open it up to any questions you've got.
No, start here. Thank you so much. We'll go to questions. We've got our first one here on the floor.
Well, a lovely presentation. Thank you very much. The word regen agriculture didn't get a mention.
Funny that.
Yes. Why has it got so much sort of mention without being challenged?
It's a bit like challenging motherhood, isn't it? I mean, a lot of these things are very warm and fuzzy and sound great, but when you actually try and nail anyone down to specifics, okay, how do you do this? It's very hard to actually get anyone to commit to specifics, and they talk in nice generalities. And I think that's the biggest problem is finding a target. it's a bit like organic agriculture. You know, you can't do this because it's bad for whatever. People tend to ignore the fact that, you know, people are going to go hungry if they don't do it, or if they do it. And so I think that's one of the problems, is the issues with getting specific about some of these approaches and actually testing them in the field, because a lot of it is hearsay. A lot of it is, you see lots of reports from people who, I did this and I got a wonderful response. And the scientist in you says, well, where was your control? Where was your reference where you did normal management to compare it to? Oh, I was in the paddock down the road 20 kilometres away. And you go, well, it's not really a fair comparison. There's a lot of things out there like that. Regen agriculture, I believe there are degrees being offered in regenerative agriculture now, which I find disturbing. I'd be interested to look at some of the course content to see what it was based upon.
That was the reason for the question. I wondered why they've got so much publicity and been accepted this week.
I'd say marketers have got a lot to do with it, but anyway, yes.
And it's the current buzzword.
Sorry.
It's the current buzzword.
Current buzzword, yeah. I mean, there's a few of them. Net zero is another one. We have some animated discussions with people who will tell you that Nestle or would pick your big food company won't buy your product unless it's certified net zero emissions. And you go, well, I'd like to know that people that could certify their product is actually net zero. And if you were only going to buy truly net zero emissions, you'd have some pretty empty shelves in terms of things to sell people, because, you know, growing foods requires you to make emissions. And it's managing those, it's minimising them. Yeah, we've got no problem with that. But some of these concepts have got a life of their own now, and they're a marketing jingle rather than something that's based on fact. And that's the difficulty, is trying to actually get to grips with some of these claims. Where's the supporting data to go with this? And there isn't any most of the time. Or people have taken a bit from, you know, work that was done in the Netherlands or, you know, Canada, and applied it to subtropical Australia and wonder why it doesn't work.
There is a movement towards agricultural sort of provenance and traceability and certification along those lines. We see that as being a positive movement in the right direction, that it's meant to provide that sort of evidence-based prevention.
I've got no problem with the provenance-based approaches at all, provided there's some realistic guidelines put around what, you know, someone who uses artificial fertilizer, for example, currently in a lot of the ESG systems I've seen promoted, that's going to be a big no-no. Now the reality is it's not a big no-no. It's a necessity. Yeah. And so it's often these provenance things have to be accompanied by some factual information about how do you compare system X with system Y in some sort of sensible fashion. Because at the moment they've come back to a lot of these warm and fuzzy sort of statements. This is good, that's bad, without a lot of the data that goes with it. So I think that's the huge challenge. I've got no problem with traceability, but I think it's the information flow that goes with it as to what some of these management decisions actually mean, that's missing at the moment.
Cool.
How big is the threat from, say, expansion of cities, and also you talk about ESG? For instance, we have an area called Redlands, which is a big basket of Queensland.
Yep.
It's all buried under drinks and water now.
Yep.
And then getting ESG, which is potentially contaminating water table and so forth.
Yeah. You've got issues of groundwater contamination, certainly in production areas. I guess I don't know enough about the potential contaminants that come with coal seam gas exploration done in different ways. So I'd stay out of that. I mean, I've probably got an opinion, but it's probably as good as anyone else's opinion. It's not necessarily based on fact. I guess I silently applaud the fact that they're not going to pump liquid CO2 into the Great Artesian Basin. I mean, to me, that was a no-brainer. But sectors of society see a way of passing on responsibility or letting someone else wear a solution for them, and that's one of the examples of it. Things like redlands, the loss of those highly productive soils under concrete is a travesty. But all you're doing then is adding food miles to, you're pushing agriculture production onto often poorer soils in tougher environments. I'm staggered by some of the food miles. We've done a bit of work with the banana producers in the back of Tully, and the logistics of that operation are unbelievable. A semi-trailer of bananas has to leave Tully at 9:15 in the morning because it has to drive all the way to Sydney to arrive in the markets at whatever the hour is the following morning and unload. And if they're half an hour late, they miss their slot at the Woolies distribution centre and they can't unload. And so this whole system, and the bananas that go from Tully to the Sydney distribution centre come back to the Woolies in Tully. Now, I mean, you look at that and you go, wow, our people are talking about inefficiencies in agriculture, and we've got a food distribution system that does things like that around the country. I'm sure it makes economic sense to someone, but in terms of food miles and things like that, it really challenges sensibility, I'd argue.
We've got some questions online here from Keegan.
Okay. Salinity. I didn't mention salinity. I guess there is a risk of storing water in profiles in some situations where you're likely to raise the water table and potentially mobilise salts with it. Most of our production systems don't have a water table to cause much of a problem. And by and large, in most of the rain-fed grain systems, we're seeing what were layers, saline layers, actually slowly getting deeper into the soil profile as those salts are leached deeper with water that does manage to penetrate. I guess most of the cropping systems these days are probably a bit hungrier than they were 20 or 30 years ago, in that they don't wait for a profile to fill up completely. They'll pull the trigger when I've got 2/3 of a soil profile full of water. Okay, I'll plant on that. And so we don't tend to have those situations very often where the profile's wet and gets wetter and wetter and wetter, or we end up with drainage because we've already got a crop in the ground using that water, trying to maximise productivity. So I think salinity is probably less of an issue in a lot of our broadacre production systems. It's certainly still an issue in irrigation areas where there's a lot of water used and you can mobilise salts and bring them back up. And I remember my days in the Ord back, that was when I was a raw undergraduate. I won't say how long ago. But when the rice industry was established up there, and one of the big challenges they had was rising water tables under the rice in the areas where they're growing rice, and it was starting to bring salt back up towards the surface there. So water's the key, or an excess of water, or poorly managed water is the key. A lot of these dryland systems where we're trying to store water, we tend to use it very efficiently. So we tend not to let it accumulate too much.
We had a second question there as well.
Oh, sorry. You mentioned a number of things people aren't well educated on, which has led to misunderstandings between rural and urban populations. What would you like to see being taught in senior school subjects like geography, earth and environmental sciences, agricultural science? That's a very fair question. One of the difficulties, I think, and this is probably based more on experience I've seen with my own daughters going through high school and the science teachers they had, and the lack of understanding the science teachers had about science, full stop, is that the teachers themselves aren't up to speed with a lot of this stuff. They're taking stuff out of sources that are approved for them. They're teaching that stuff without necessarily having the understanding. One of the things we're trying to do at UQ is to try to form closer links with high schools, particularly agricultural students in high schools. But I think the comment here is, or the question here is more valid because it relates to the STEM subjects in general. So any science subjects, particularly the biological sciences, I think we could do far better job of linking to high school students and to high school teachers to ensure that there's a more balanced approach to teaching of science that's based on real world examples rather than things taken from a textbook. I know when I was at Kingaroy, we used to work with the biological science students in year 11 and 12, and they had to do what they called an extended experimental investigation, which was had to do a research project. And the high school teachers sort of threw their hands up in the air and said, well, we don't know what to do with them. And we, looking for cheap labour, of course, we said, we'll send them out and they can work with us. So we had a great time for about 4 or 5 years there, where we dreamt up all sorts of little projects that you never had time to do yourself, but the kids got interested in. And unfortunately, I can't claim to have ever converted one into an agricultural scientist, but I think by the time they finished, these guys had a much better appreciation of scientific method and biology and in the real world. And I think I'd love to see more of that sort of stuff. But the distances between high schools, I mean, it's a challenge. We're in the process now of trying to increase our undergraduate enrolments in agricultural science. And lots of surveys around saying, oh, there's not many people doing agriculture in high school, so you've got a low feed-in cohort. And I look at that and say our feed-in cohort is anyone who does science in high school, because they could end up working in agriculture. They could be interested in robotics. They could be interested in satellites. They could be interested in anything. They could be interested in big data and mathematics. And we could have them working on agricultural problems for the rest of their career. And the challenge is to hook them on real world problems at some stage. Whether we get them in undergraduate or whether we get them out of the broader science graduates, I think agriculture needs to do a better job of promoting careers and problem solving and issue solving in agriculture that are available in agriculture, that this modern technology can be deployed into. Because we'll never teach anything in an agricultural degree. We won't teach enough robotics to be useful. We won't teach enough remote sensing to be useful. All we can do is touch on it and look at the applications of it. But if you get someone who's whiz bang in one of these areas and you can deploy them on an agricultural related issue, then you get them hooked, because this is interesting. This is the real world for what they studied for. And I think that's our challenge, is to try and better promote the problem solving and the environmental solutions that people can work on in agriculture at the same time as achieving food security. And to me, that would be a big hook. Whether there's the jobs and the pay out there to go with people's expectations, I'm not necessarily sure. But certainly I know in agricultural science, we graduate around the country, probably 20% of the jobs that are available in agriculture. The other 80% aren't coming from agricultural graduates. So there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Do we have any final questions from audience? One here and then one there.
If I could hear your previous question.
Yeah, just in terms of water usage,
Louder.
it seems that we're going to the stupid extreme, where you're talking about planting rice, cotton. Now apparently almonds are really huge. We've got a limited water supply in the country. Can we incorporate, I don't know much about the native options, obviously that's a niche market still, but can we incorporate more realistic or feasible crops to plant that will suit various conditions?
That's, I guess, the answer in the short term would be it's challenging, I think. In the longer term, I mean, if you listen to the guys into gene modification and molecular biology, they can grow a corn plant that has nodules and 3 ears and a couple of wings. I mean, they can do anything. All they need is time and money. So I think there's a time frame around a lot of these things about what's possible and what isn't. Certainly, I think there's rationalisation happening in terms of water licences, for example. I mean, the rice industry is under huge pressure in Australia in an environment where water is regulated very tightly. A lot of the other systems that are being exploited, I guess, the almonds and the other bits and pieces, tend to have water that's not in regulated schemes. So they've either harvested themselves or they're exploiting their own aquifers and whatever, which are not necessarily related to major artesian basins. And they're going wherever the money is. And so, I mean, if you look at, if you've got farm storage of water on the Darling Downs, you'll be growing cotton because it pays twice as much as most of the grain crops. If you haven't got water, then you'll be starting to say, okay, where's my most reliable bet? But the financial pressure that most agricultural enterprises are under, you've got to chase the dollars in many instances. So yes, we're very conscious of water use efficiency and using it as effectively as we can. But you've also got to make money in the process. And this is one of the fundamental challenges I think that agriculture's got. There's a whole lot of things that you'd like to do. We'd like to grow green manure crops and turn them back into soil to improve our soil fertility, but we can't make money out of them. And so we tend not to do it because we've got to keep the bank manager happy at the same time. So there's this fundamental trade-off that money always is a great leveler and it influences a whole lot of decisions.
Final question here. Yep.
Has there ever been any talk or grumbles at government level about quarantining fertile soil away from housing?
We went through a period there, certainly in Queensland, where there was the definition of prime agricultural land. Some of you will remember that was supposed to be sacrosanct and not used for anything else until something else came along that was more valuable or had a bit more political clout. Or so I think those things are somewhat elastic. I think the concept is certainly valid. How far you go, I guess, depends on the pressure to change that zoning. And so the prime agricultural land one is a classic example. And I guess you start to talk about competition for land use. I know, and I do a lot of work in Bundaberg as well in the sugar industry, and you're seeing sugar displaced by macadamias and avocados that are funded through superannuation retirement schemes. Now, is that the best use of land? You end up closing sugar mills, you end up completely rearranging communities. And so these sorts of decisions are happening all the time. Whether you can actually regulate them in some sort of ironclad way, I guess you end up in courts. Having a daughter who's a lawyer, you know what, end up in court, certainly not against her. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, but it is an issue that the more pressure our food production systems come under, the more these sorts of questions are going to be asked. And I guess has anyone got the political will to make that decision?
Brilliant. If we have no further questions, one more and then we'll have to
You haven't mentioned that your faculty is quite forward thinking. You run the only agricultural policy course in Australia. It's not more than I did in Stockwater last year. It's continuing. It was in advance for a while, but it was seen in your master's program, as I understand, a necessity because most of them you work in policy. For the last 15, 20 minutes, have we been talking policy?
We have. And as someone who worked in the State Department with a policy section in it, I used to find it really disturbing how little communication there was between people who were developing policy for agricultural ministers and people who actually worked in the industries that those policies affected. And so again, you get this disconnect between the policymakers and the actual people working in the industries. And I agree, it's really, really important. but how you force better connections between policymakers and people on the ground. I guess the thing that worries me more is that it's a bit like everything else that's going on in society, in my perspective at the moment, is that people tend to be in two camps. You're either with me or you're against me. And so if you're against me, then I'm going to say whatever it takes to beat you. Whether it's right or not is another matter. And I think we've got lobby groups that are appearing that are trying to influence policy and influence other decisions, who are muddying the waters in many extents because they're pushing their side and the other side are pushing a different one. For my sins working in the sugar industry and a lot of that nitrogen management, reef water quality space, I used to often be in a room between the Greenpeace guys and the cane growers guys. And I can tell you, it wasn't a very pleasant space to be sitting in the middle, trying to mediate between those two who would never consider the other person's perspective. So I think that's a challenge. And it comes back to the point I made here about communicators. We've really got to do a better job of communicating some of these issues from a science-based perspective and from an industry reality perspective to the broader community, because people aren't getting the basic facts they need to make an informed decision. Whether they then use them to make a rational decision is another matter, but at least if you give them access to the information, they can't claim ignorance.
Well, thank you, Mike. Some
Thanks.
fascinating insights, and I think we've all learned plenty about.
I hope you didn't get any death threats.
No,
Organic farming or something.
it's been fascinating. Please join me in thanking Mike again for his presentation. And with that, it brings us to an end for our lecture this evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online and here in person. We'll see you again for another RGSQ event very soon. For those in the room, drinks and some light snacks are available at the back of the room.